Hello everybody, welcome back to Gentlemen for Cinephiles. So I'm so excited because we are going to be talking about one of my favorite films of all time, and that is Midsommar. Now this film actually is on my top 10 films that describe me. It recently replaced Rosemary's Baby. I had Rosemary's Baby on my list as like a film that was really strongly encapsulated, abuse that I had experienced. I related very strongly to Rosemary's Baby for that reason because I felt heard, right? In like my own experiences watching Rosemary's Baby made me feel like my experience was seen and I was able to process through it using the movie. Midsommar hits the same kind of level to me. It really helped me process through, every single relationship I've ever been in a very strong way because of just I feel so close to Danny's character because I feel like I strongly understand what she went through, and Midsommar came at a very important time in my life. And honestly, it was weird because like I didn't really feel horror throughout the film. Um I felt very cathartic, and I felt like very like I don't know, it's really weird to articulate and explain. I felt very um cathartic is just the best way to spell it. Oh no, I felt empowered. That's the best way to describe it. I felt very empowered. So Midsommar, we're actually just gonna go kind of plot point by plot point and kind of follow through the plot and to kind of discuss things for that. Just because it's such a nuanced film, and if you haven't quite seen it, it'd be kind of difficult to just kind of do a basic analysis of it without giving some summary. So just know that going in, there might be some spoilers here if you haven't seen Midsommar yet, but yes. So Danny, the film opens with the lead character, Danny. Her and her boyfriend are having all these problems and blah. But the caveat is her sister, whom is, I don't know if she is bipolar. I think she specifically has bipolar. I'm not 100% sure. But her sister is very suicidal and she kills herself and her parents through a carbon monoxide, poisoning in their house. And so it's, yeah, it's just, the whole relationship that's set up between Danny and her boyfriend is very fascinating to me because I personally feel very close to it. And it helped me process through a lot, but also just because it's so beautifully done and realistically done. Honestly, that's the most horrifying element of the film. It's this idea that Danny, who is going through so much, she's going through so much, she's experiencing so much on a very human, traumatic level, but she's with somebody who's so emotionally distant that he can't help her, you know what I mean? And it's not that he's a bad person, it's just that he can't help her because he's on a different wavelength, and he's not being in any way, shape, or form kind to her needs at all. And it's not because he's a selfish person or a selfish character, you know what I mean? As the narrative goes on, I think he grows into that. But I think at the beginning of the film, his emotional distance just comes from the fact that he doesn't know any better and he doesn't know how to help because he's never experienced into anything to her level that she's experiencing. So then moving on, so one of their friends, it comes from a Swedish community, I believe, and they all go with him to a midsummer celebration at his big community. It's like one that occurs every 90 years. It's a very important one. And so they all fly out there. And so, yeah, speaking of the relationship thing, he tries not to tell Danny about it, but she comes. So yeah. They all fly to Sweden and then they arrive at a commune. And the very interesting thing here that comes up is kind of, this is something at a high point that I saw a lot of people talking about, and I'm just going to mention it here. I don't think it like takes away or adds from my perspective because I haven't had this experience, but apparently the drug sequences of like acid are very realistic. So that's super fascinating. All the hallucinations that they go on. So yeah. So then the film starts progressing and they're all out, doing this midsummer celebration, X, Y, and Z. And the thing that's so beautiful about the film is the way the film is very open about what it is, and also the way the film is shot. The way the film is shot is not, it's very intriguing how it plays with horror because it's so bright. It's almost like the reverse. It's almost like if giallo film went in a kind of different direction. The film is so bright and full of so many, bright colors. The film gives you a very false sense of security throughout the way it's filmed and shot and the way it's color graded because, to your brain, you're not connecting the dots of, we often have this idea in film that dark equals scary, dark equals bad, lower colors, darker colors, like it's nighttime, there are shadows, X, Y, and Z, and that's bad. Midsommar is completely not, it doesn't have any of that. It doesn't indulge in any of that kind of lens on horror that we often see in film. And so it's a very disarming experience, especially when it comes to the very strong sequences of violence. So the very first strong sequence of violence that comes up is there's a suicide pact, I suppose, the best way I can describe it. I'm not necessarily familiar in, like, the cultural terminology, or I'm not very familiar in the terminology behind it, other than that it's a agreed upon suicide for these two elders. So they go to the top of this, like, hill, this rock hill, and then they completely just jump off and are just die. And it's really crazy when it happens in the film, because the whole film, it feels very like a rubber band, like being pulled and pulled and pulled and pulled the entire film, and you don't get the snap until the final moment of the movie. But so at this point, nothing horrifying has happened, and this is probably like what feels like a half hour into the movie, because the movie is pretty long, but it feels like it happens in 20 minutes, because it's just it's just that much of an experience that you're just so locked into. Um, so once this moment of violence happens, it's not a cathartic experience, because the rubber band just kind of keeps pulling and pulling and pulling. But it's very interesting and it's very intriguing too, the angle it comes at, because everyone is horrified, rightfully so, by the situation. But then there's this whole cultural element brought into it, where it's like, no, no, you don't understand. This is agreed upon. They wanted this. Blah 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 blah. This is part of our culture. You need to understand that. You know, you need to learn about that. All of that. And it's very interesting how the different men react to the situations that keep getting brought up. So then the other point of violence that comes is the man of there's a man and a woman who both jump from the cliff, right? And so then the man is still alive, like barely hanging on to life. And there's a woman who is kind of like, she's framed as the leader of this, like, cult situation. And she goes with a giant mallet and just starts, uh, crushing his skull with a mallet. And it's just so disgusting, just to be straight up. It's disgusting. It's very horrifying body gore. It's very realistic, and it's very disarming, because, like I said, you've been being fed this kind of like almost fantasy land this entire time, where things are slightly off. There's nothing that fully is off until this moment when these two people jump from this cliff, and then one of them has to be, malleted to death. But there are things slightly off throughout that bring enough tension that when this moment hits, it doesn't it's a lot, and it takes the film to another level, but at the same time it doesn't feel like it comes out of nowhere, because of how there's little nuances in the background that just kind of make you tense and make you feel like there's something wrong here. So then everybody is very disturbed by it, and they all decide, they try and leave, but they all decide to stay because Danny's, who they're going with, their friend, one of their friends, he's writing a thesis about these traditions, and it's a subject of his thesis, so he really feels like he needs to stay and he needs to experience this, which I think it's a very interesting angle in the film too, that it takes with the subject of the thesis level, because, you know, because it's so fascinating, because Danny's boyfriend also decides to write a thesis about, the situation. Um, and so they get into a fight over it. The two men get into a fight over it, and it's like, you just saw two people commit suicide, and then one of them get malleted to death, and you're fighting over who gets to write about this experience for a thesis paper. And it's a very interesting, because we've talked about this before on the podcast, I think particularly in Rope, but this kind of thing scholars fall into, where sometimes they distance themselves so much from the world around them that there's almost this kind of superiority that takes place and that occurs, where scholars sometimes feel like they're above society, or the rules don't apply to them, X, Y, and Z. And I think the same thing happens here, and it's kind of like the fallacy of hubris that follows the men in this film in particular, which was another super fascinating angle to go with, because I see that a lot in the, not I see that a lot as a woman who is in a scholar situations. I do see a lot of hubris coming from, particularly male scholars in a very interesting way that I think this film directly confronts. But yes, okay, so to continue on, there are two other tourists that are with them, and they both leave at this point. And there's a whole, situation that pulls the rubber band even tighter. So they're a couple, and when they pack up to leave after this suicide, the rubber band kind of just keeps pulling steadily, and the woman in the couple packs up and she goes to find her boyfriend and be like, we're leaving, and he is just nowhere to be found. Everyone tells her that he went to the train station already without her. He told her he'd meet her there, and she gets really weirded out, and then she leaves, and then that's pretty much it. There's a scream in the background, very vaguely, and if you're not paying attention, you kind of miss it, but the rubber band just kind of keeps pulling from there. And then the festivities just kind of keep going. And so this is actually when the thesis problems start to come about, and all the men fight over the thesis and whatever. So in terms of the whole, angle of, scholars feeling like sometimes they're above society's rules, you get that very strongly. So the character who originally was writing the thesis is named Josh. And so Josh is trying to seek out this information. He's trying to be respectful about it in a very weird kind of way, which I also appreciate the film dealing with, because a lot of people, particularly scholars, and I've seen this happen a lot, they want to understand another culture, but they still otherize the culture, right? So they still kind of see it as, well, I'm part of this culture and they're kind of weird over there, but that's their cultural thing, I guess. And so there's this superiority and this hubris that's kind of created as a scholar, especially when you're studying another group of people, right? It's very easy to otherize a group of people. And this is particularly straight up what's happening in this situation, and which is why I think all these men and all these characters are lulled into a false sense of security when it comes to the real danger that they're in. So then, you see him trying to learn about the practices of this cult, of this, situation, this commune. And so he's found out all this stuff. It indulges in the kind of same horror as, something like The Witch. It feels very similar to something like The Witch, this whole kind of folk horror genre. But so yes, when we are looking at Josh, he's trying to collect all this information, and he's told explicitly not to go and look at this very important, text to this culture. He ignores that, and he goes in and he looks at the book anyway, because the rules don't apply to him, and then he's murdered and he's killed, and it's very horrifying. And in between this, there's a third friend who, he pees on an ancient tree that's very important and is destroyed, and it makes everyone very angry, and then he's also killed. So it's very interesting because these characters are victims, but you don't necessarily see them as such, because at the very beginning of the film, when the suicide pact happens, it's very interesting because the suicide pact, they agreed to commit suicide for cultural reasons, right? But then when it moves into all of these people who are, being taken by the cult, and, for, this sacrifice and this Midsommar celebration that you find out later, all of them in some way or another perpetrated something against the cult. They're not necessarily innocent people who are getting murdered, right? It's not like a Friday the 13th situation in which none of these kids did anything and they're just getting murdered for no reason, really. It's not like that. There are, for example, not saying that. Now, I'm not saying that, they should be murdered for what they did, but I'm just saying it's very interesting to place us characters in this situation where they're not perfect victims, and that you feel so bad for them, They're put in this place where they're otherizing another culture, they're otherizing a group of people, and then, their hubris is being put into place and checked, which is very fascinating to me. So then, yes, continuing to move down. I'm skipping some of the horrifying elements of it just because I'm trying to go plot point by plot point, but just know the film is a lot. My favorite part of the film is the May pole dance, and it's my favorite part in the entire thing, because I just feel it's just so much like, okay, so Danny goes to, the maypole dance competition. They take psychedelics, and then what they do is they all go around the maypole until one is left standing, and that just happens to be Danny. And during this whole situation and during the whole film up until this point, there's this very interesting plot thread that is kind of like, I'm not going to call it a B plot thread, but it's kind of just under the surface of the basic, things of this is all happening and there's something under the surface. And so that all has to do with this sex ritual with one of the women in the cult who is trying to get impregnated by Danny's boyfriend. And so it's very fascinating. So you get this cloth at the beginning that the film, you get this cloth at the beginning that the filmmakers linger on very strongly, and it walks through kind of this step process of how a woman makes a man fall in love with her in terms of the mythology of the cult, right? So she it, uh, it's very gross. Um, I believe it's she like puts pubic hair and blood in like period blood into a cup that he drinks. She puts a rune under his bed, and then like the cultists set up this situation in which there's a ritual sex scene where he impregnates her. And so when Danny becomes May Queen, she does a tour of everything, and blesses all the plants or whatever. And her boyfriend at the time, is moves into doing this sex cult ritual. And it is just it's such a heartbreaking moment. And I feel sick talking about it because it just hit me so hard during the film. Because I think it's just tantamount to this relationship breakdown, and it's something that like hit me hard for very personal reasons. But so Danny gets back, and she sees that something's going on in this place where the ritual sex scene is happening, and she goes after it, and all the women try and stop her, but she knows something's wrong, and she goes to see it, and she looks in and she sees her boyfriend impregnating another woman. And it's just it's just horrifying. And so she freaks out, she starts sobbing and screaming, and all these women follow her. And then you get that scene that you see in the trailer where she's screaming and crying, and then they all start screaming and crying so that she can get her feelings out. And it's just, I'm getting like I'm having a hard time talking about it because it's just such a raw and real moment, and it's so fascinating how all the women come together. And I think that's why the film feels, it's weird because like I think the film feels very empowering to me because I felt like I was heard, you know what I mean, in the film. Woo! Sorry, I'm getting emotional. Jeez. I felt like I was heard with everything I had gone through with, relationships and stuff, going back however many years I've been in relationships with people, since early high school on. And it just it felt so cathartic in the moment because all these women are around her. Oh, jeez. Sorry. Oh, geez, sorry everyone, I'm getting emotional. All these women around her are trying to make, it's so weird to articulate. All these women around her are trying to show her that she's not alone in the experience she's having by trying to place themselves in the same experience. And so she's going through deep tragedy, but they're all around her, not letting her go through it alone. And it's a really weird, like empowering, cathartic moment that's also at the same time really horrifying to watch. But yeah, so geez. So then after this happens and the ritual happens and all this stuff, that's when the film kind of has like, it's like it goes from 0 to 100, because the film it's being pulled like the entire time. The rubber band's slowly being pulled back at the same pace, but there are little moments where you think it might snap, you know what I mean? There are like moments where it's like really intense. So like particularly, the suicide pact, the man going to get the ritual book and like looking at the text and then getting killed, you know, the ritual sex scene, and then like the screaming and the all that stuff. And that's a lot, but the film really kind of takes off at this point. It's revealed that all four people who came along, for the trip, the couple, and then the two male friends that were murdered along, it's revealed that all of them have been, human sacrificed and killed for the commune, for this ritual, for this like midsummer celebration. Um, then the two elders and there are two volunteers that, you know, offer to give themselves up to evil. So those two volunteers come forward, and then they're all put in this yellow house that sits there the entire time, the entire film in the background. Um, and Danny, since she is May Queen, gets to choose the ninth and final victim. She chooses her boyfriend. She chooses him to be the ninth and final victim. And it's a very, you know, Wicker Man. He's put into a disemboweled bear, and he, you know, he's put in a temple, and then the temple set on fire. And the very last shot of the film is Danny with her head held high, smiling. And honestly, it was just, I cried for so long because it just makes so much sense that she chooses him, and it makes so much sense that, you know, she's empowered in this situation. And it's so fascinating. You know, she loses her family, she finds a new one in a really like weird, you know, effed up way, but just, oh my god, I'm gonna read you guys this. There's this review that I think perfectly explains how I felt about it, and I think it really explains how I felt about it in this moment in particular. So it says, as Midsommar began to escalate, all of my fear disappeared, my dread and all my tension vanished. I feel like I have a crown of flowers too. And it's from a reviewer named Markella on Letterboxd. And just just the way it's so raw and so realistic in this very extreme situation is so fascinating and cathartic and very, it was just such an amazing experience. And yeah, it's full of horror and it's a horrifying situation and all this stuff, but the film feels very, I don't know, it felt very, it helps me process through so much in a very weird way, that I really appreciate the film for what it is. But the other way, so aside, now that we've talked about the plot, and I think the honesty of that comes from, Astor wrote the screenplay as a response to a really bad breakup that he had, and I think that's the reason why it feels so real and it feels so honest, you know what I mean? And particularly for me, who really strongly identifies with everything Danny went through, goes through, it's just, oh, it just blew my mind. And like honestly, the acting is so excellent, and that's a super high point of the film, but the narrative is also very, very tight. And I think in a lot of ways it's difficult. I was talking to my friend Vince about this. You might have heard him in past episodes, like the Amadeus one. But I don't think you quite understand the film, and I don't think you're able to understand the film and appreciate it to its full capacity unless you've experienced deep trauma. And you know, I think that's just, I see that very strongly in the film. Like the reason I love the film so much and the reason why the film is so effective for me is because it speaks very honestly in an extreme way to very real trauma that I've experienced. And so I loved that about the film, and I think it's just so well done. And so yes, so to talk about, yeah, let's talk about some of the nuances too that creates horror. I talked a lot throughout the podcast about how it's a very consistent pacing the entire way through, but the way the tension is related to that pacing is very fascinating because it feels like it's interesting because the tension feels like it's taking forever and it's really stressful, but at the same time when the film's over it doesn't feel like it was too long, which is something that's very fascinating to me, how the pacing worked out. In addition to that, just the way that the whole entire experience functioned, particularly the cinematography. And when I say the cinematography, I think the cinematographic quality of the film and the way the actors and the extras were used is very effective, because the most unsettling thing about the film, because it comes at a subconscious level, it's not in a way like, you know, the Insidious films use like really high pitched noises that you can't quite pick up to create tension. That's not necessarily what I'm talking about. Um, the film uses the entire frame to create this unsettling tension, particularly, you know, the way that people are on psychedelics in the background, and the way, you know, they'll be walking and then they'll just stop and then they'll just stand there and then they'll just look around and then they'll just keep going. Or a bunch of people will walk by and like be doing some weird stuff, but nobody acknowledges it and it's all just happening in the background. And while you may not pick it up every time, the subtlety of your, well, while you may not consciously pick it up all the time, the way your subconscious brain processes that in the background in relation to what's going on in the normal scene that you're supposed to be viewing and paying attention to, it creates so much tension because it creates this off-kilter experience to the entire film as a whole. And that's, I think, the thing that really takes it from, you know, a really good horror film to a great horror film, is the way every single bit of the film was used to create tension. And then also at the moments where, you know, there are gore and there are graphics, it's done very effectively in that it's swift, it's hyper realistic, and then it's over. And you're left with, what did I just see? That was horrifying. You know what I mean? It doesn't linger on the violence. It doesn't linger on, you know, the horrifying elements that are traditional horror elements. It leaves them so that they have an impact on you, and then you're left to unpack it while the narrative just kind of keeps going along, and that's very fascinating too. And that's a very fascinating directorial decision, and that's a very excellent one as well. So yeah, I think that this film is excellent, and I am actually like so appreciative of this film. This film helped me get through so much, and you know, I hope that's not like a weird thing for all of you out there. I hope you're not like, what the fuck is she talking about? What does that mean? Top 10 films that describe her, what the hell? But yeah, this film just, it helped me through a lot, and it means a lot to me, and I think it's an excellent example of a modern horror film. I think it's an excellent example of a folk horror film, and I think you should give it a look-see. But thank you guys so much for watching. Well, you can follow me at _RenaissanceWoman on Instagram. You can follow the podcast anywhere podcasts are listened to, as well as anywhere that, you know, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, all that stuff. You can follow us all there, and I'll see you guys tomorrow. Bye!